Welcome to the History of the English Language class. This two-part lecture will serve as an introduction to the course subject matter. In particular, this lecture will introduce you to the time periods into which the historical development of English is traditionally divided. This division is not random. Momentous historical events and developments are associated with each period. These events and developments influenced how the English language use and structure changed in very significant ways. Further, we will briefly discuss two directions of language change, synchronic and diachronic, and classify factors that affect such change, distinguishing between those elements of change that are internal and external to the language. Examples of both external and internal factors will be provided. So, let's begin. Time periods of English. Historically, the development of the English language can be divided into three stages: Old, Middle, and Modern. But to understand how English came to be as a language, we need to start a little bit before its birth, in the mid-5th century CE, current era. The mid-5th century is the time when the people speaking precursor dialects of our current tongue arrived on the British Isles. Before that, the islands were populated by a variety of native tribes speaking a variety of Celtic languages. Celtic languages were not indigenous to the Isles either, but they largely replaced the indigenous speakers much earlier, about 500 years before current era. We won't need to go that far back in history because these languages left little to no influence on English at all. There are few, if any, surviving records of all the languages spoken on the British Isles before the Germanic invasion. Of course, some languages continue to be spoken: Welsh, Cornish, Gaelic in its multiple dialects, and so on, but their speakers were pushed far west upon the Roman invasion that began, first unsuccessfully, by Julius Caesar in 55 BCE. It was completed quite successfully by his successor 4 generations down the road, Emperor Claudius, in 50 CE. Romans subjugated and assimilated the local population to a great degree over the next 4 centuries. So by the time Germanic-speaking tribes arrived on the islands, Latin was probably the main language of the British population, with some influence of Celtic languages. This sociolinguistic situation persisted until the early 5th century CE, current era, when the Roman legions and governing classes were compelled to leave the British Isles by the events that eventually led to the collapse of the Western Roman Empire on the continent. Britain became the lost province. The result was the de facto split of this province into smaller kingdoms and the increased flux of Germanic mercenaries, warriors, and settlers. According to the account presented by the Venerable Bede in the early 8th century, Anglo-Saxon invaders arrived in Britain in 449 CE. They brought their Germanic dialects with them, including an extremely rich morphology, complex verb conjugation patterns, noun and adjective declension paradigms, an intricate system of determiners, and so on. These dialects served as a foundation of Old English, of which we have documentary evidence through a limited number of surviving texts. Old English gradually developed into several mutually intelligible dialects, distinct from the dialects of the continental Saxons, Angles, Jutes, and Franks. These dialects were used by the people living in what is now England, until a drastic social, cultural, and linguistic change took place in 1066. This is when William the Bastard, a Norman duke, later known as William the Conqueror, claimed his right to the English throne and took it through military action. At that point, Old English began to change under the influence of Norman French into what eventually became Middle English. This process involved the loss of almost all German morphology and replacement of approximately 85% of the Germanic vocabulary with words of Romance origin. Anglo-Norman French was predominant in use among those in power, the nobility, until the 13th century. The lower classes probably continued to use Old English, but gradually the two languages intermingled and formed a new, hybrid language that was Middle English. It is this new variety of English that began to be re-established as the language of the English people in the 13th century. In the 15th century, William Caxton brought the printing press to England from the continent. The expansion of the printed word and education through mass-produced, by medieval standards, texts led to the stabilization of orthography, or, in plain language, spelling. By the time Henry VIII came to the throne and Protestantism took root, the language shifted again significantly, becoming more intelligible to a modern reader and speaker. Essentially, in the 16th century, the early modern English language emerged, influenced by the Renaissance, the increased interest in the humanistic learning and classical writings, as well as natural sciences. As a result, English vocabulary became greatly enriched by vocabulary of Greek and Latin origin. At the same time, the great vowel shift, which began in the middle of the 14th century, took place. The great vowel shift took up pretty much the whole Middle English period, completing by the early 18th century. This change in the pronunciation of vowels is particularly responsible for the irregularity and complexity of English spelling today. The written orthography remained fairly stable and resistant to change, while the way people pronounced words gradually shifted. Simultaneously, the age of discovery and exploration, kicked off by the Portuguese and Spanish in the 15th century, led to increased contacts with other cultures and languages all over the world, bringing new concepts and new words into the English language. Colonies were established, and these colonies developed their own local dialects. Rhode Island became the first British colony in history to declare independence. And later, the United States of America was established as a nation. The dialects spoken here were well on the way now to become large, widely recognized regional varieties of English. The British colonial policy ratcheted up taking English to all corners of the world by the early 19th century. At the same time, the American colonies became a nation of their own and were well on the way gaining prominence in the world, even though in the 19th century America was still pretty much a backwater country. The tremendous social and cultural upheaval that took place in Britain itself during the Industrial Revolution, and eventually unprecedented advances in technology and communication, resulted in the establishment of large regional varieties of English that are recognizable today. They were not much different in each region of the world from the present-day English spoken in these regions. In other words, a 19th century American spoke and wrote in a way that would be very similar to your own speech, at least from the linguistic, not necessarily rhetorical point of view. But variation in English was not limited to large national varieties. As English came in contact with African, Central American, Caribbean, and Asian languages, multiple world Englishes were born. A native speaker of English in Ghana today does not speak in the same way as a native speaker in Jamaica, or Singapore, or India, or Belize, but they all speak one of the dozens, if not hundreds, of varieties of present-day English that exist in the world. To recap, in this section, you have learned about 3 key periods in the history of the English language: Old English, Middle English, and Modern English. Modern English is subdivided into Early Modern and Present-day English. We have also discussed the central historical events, including invasions, religious, cultural, and scientific developments, and colonization that influenced English structure and use every step of the way. We will return to these events in more detail as we study English at each period in its development in more depth throughout the semester. Now, let's talk more about how and why language changes.